So for anybody that might be watching from outside this room, we say welcome. Hopefully this is the first time that we have streamed any of these classes. We've been getting together for several months, so this and hopefully it'll be beneficial to everybody that's listening. So what I wanted to do is to spend a few minutes looking and considering what happened today with the peace plan that President Trump put forth. This has been labeled the deal of the century, and it's a peace plan that's not really dissimilar to a lot of the other peace plans that go all the way back to the Oslo Accords in '93, and then the Saudi Arabian plan and all the various initiatives, because everybody wants to, all presidents would love to be able to be the one that can bring about peace in the Middle East. So I want to highlight some of the key parts, and then just see what the Bible has to say. Not to draw conclusions, but let's see what God has to say about some of these initiatives. So let me just kind of provide an overview. This was a news release that I came across earlier today that summarizes some of it. Now, as I understand, the plan itself is 80-some pages long, so obviously we're not going to be able to go into all the details, but some of the key points, and then as you can well imagine, I've got a couple of comments I'd like to make as we go through it. But first of all, President Trump today called for a two-state solution to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as he unveiled the details of his administration's much-awaited Mideast peace plan. And I think, as we've said many times, I mean, President Trump has done really wonderful things for Israel by recognizing Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, recognizing the Golan Heights as their territory, and agreeing to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Really good things. But I have to admit that the one thing that I've been concerned about, and I think a lot of others are concerned about for reasons that we'll discuss in a moment, that the idea of creating a new state within the state of Israel is not something I believe that God is going to approve of. To say nothing of the fact that I don't think it's going to work anyway. But be that as it may, I'm passing out, and for those that are on that are watching, I'm not sure how we can provide that, but I'm passing out a couple of maps that depict what the plan is supposed to accomplish, and another map that we'll talk about in a moment. But if you look at the map, we'll get that in a minute, but let me just continue with what he had to say. My vision, this is President Trump, presents a win-win situation for both sides. Today, Israel has taken a giant step toward peace. We also know that, at least so far, the so-called Palestinians have rejected the idea, as we all, I think, knew they would. They rejected it out of hand, that it's not something that they're likely to approve. We don't know what kind of political pressure will be brought by other Arab nations, but we know that the Palestinians so far have rejected the plan. And then President Trump goes on to say the Palestinians may not have an opportunity like this ever again. And then Bibi Netanyahu was with President Trump at the time, and he said that this deal presents the right balance between Israeli security and Palestinian aspirations. And again, we'll talk through that a little bit. He added, it's a great plan for Israel. It's a great plan for peace. And we'll see. Now, White House officials described the plan as realistic and said Israel is prepared to act. According to White House officials, the plan calls for a two-state solution, including the state of Israel and the future state of Palestine. Palestine is going to have to meet certain conditions, and from what I understand, it's going to be about 4 years, or they're going to have to go through a 4-year process before any state will be declared. Under the plan, the Palestinians would have to reach certain benchmarks to achieve a state. Those benchmarks include rooting out terrorism, stopping what they call pay for slay, implementing steps toward free speech and other political reforms. The plan is a basis for negotiations with Israel. So the plan or the idea is that there'll be negotiations that'll take place between the Palestinians and Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu did say and agree that they're willing to sit down and to commence these negotiations, as did Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz is the political rival that will be on the ticket when the elections take place in March, which will be the third time. The vision calls for more than doubling the amount of territory the Palestinians control. Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, that's where their capital is going to be, where the United States, according to President Trump, would happily open an embassy. The plan includes a map of a contiguous Palestinian state in the West Bank with a proposed tunnel to connect the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I mean, for the longest time, people wondered, well, part of this Palestinian state is Gaza, and part of it's West Bank, which is separated by Israel proper. How do you connect and how do you get the two of them together? And so apparently the plan is to build a tunnel. So there would also be land swaps south of Gaza to give the Palestinians more territory. This is the first time Israel has agreed to a Palestinian state with defined borders. And President Trump passed out the map, or the map was included as part of the agreement that he's putting forth. As part of the plan, Israel has agreed to halt settlement construction for 4 years. But in one detail sure to provoke Palestinian objections, the plan recognizes Israeli settlement sovereignty over major settlement blocks in the West Bank. The plan calls for a demilitarized Palestinian state. Israel would maintain overall security, though it does create programs for the Palestinians to show the capability to secure their areas. So I'm not going to read more of this. Essentially, if you look at the map, which is part of the plan, that's this map here. That's the one that allegedly lays out what will be the new state of Palestine. And while we're doing that, let's go to Genesis chapter 13, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But I think that's probably a good place to start when we get into our discussion. But you'll note here on the right, this map is the current state of Israel. And if anybody's looking in this, these maps are readily available on the internet if you want to pull those up. And the blue area is what is ultimately going to be, or is being proposed to be, part of the new state of Palestine. And if you look at Jerusalem, you'll see a star. That star represents the city of Jerusalem. Now, the plan calls for Jerusalem, east and west, which includes Temple Mount, to be the undivided capital of Israel. And I would say right at the beginning, that is not something that's going to sit well with Turkey, with Erdogan, or Iran, or many of the other Arab nations around. And then we've talked a lot about Ezekiel 38 and 39, the major parties to that confederacy that will ultimately move on Israel includes Turkey. And Erdogan is determined to making Jerusalem a part of the Muslim caliphate that is the vision for a lot of the Muslims in that part of the world. So that is not going to go over well. Now, he did, and I'm not sure what exactly this includes, but outside Temple Mount, there's a little area right to the south of that, just to the lower right, which is a part of eastern Jerusalem. And I'd have to get a better idea of what that boundary is going to be, but that's going to be, under this plan, the capital of the new state of Palestine. So they did carve out a small part of Jerusalem to ultimately become the capital of the Palestinian state. Now you'll see all these circles within the blue areas in what was known as the West Bank. There's 15 of those, and you'll see in the legend to the left, these are Israeli enclave communities. There's 15 of those that are already occupied by Israelis. They're small neighborhoods, villages, towns, or whatever. The plan is for those to remain in place. You often hear the term that this is all occupied territory. That's what the enemies of Israel will call it. It's occupied territory, which means that as long as these enclaves exist, in my view, they're going to say they're still occupied. They're not going to be, quote, unoccupied, according, in my view, to the Palestinians until all of the people in those enclaves are forced to leave. So, but at any rate, that's part of the plan, is that they will remain there. And on the map on the left, you can see in the shaded blue area, if you can look just to the left of the Dead Sea, you see the town of Hebron. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Well, let's just take a look at Genesis chapter 13 first, and then we'll talk about Hebron. Genesis 13, this is the Lord speaking to still Abram at this time. His name had not been changed to Abraham. And we read in verse 14 of Genesis 13, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, this is where Abraham and Lot went their own separate ways. Lot went over and settled into what ultimately became, or was at that time, Sodom, which we know the story that occurred there. Lift up your eyes from where you are. This is the Lord speaking to Abram. And look north and south, east and west. In other words, as far as you can see from where you're standing. He said, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring, what? Forever. This is an outgrowth, if you will, of the Abrahamic covenant, where God said, and it's a covenant, it's a unilateral, unconditional covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of their descendants, and it's an eternal, everlasting covenant. So he said, I will give you and your offspring this land forever. I will make your offspring. Now remember, this is before Israel, this is God had already made, just in the preceding short period of time, had made the promise to Abraham that he was going to create a nation from Abraham and Sarah, and that their descendants would be as numerous as the dust on the earth. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that anyone, if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go and walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. So the reason for beginning in Genesis 13:14, if you look on this map to the left, Hebron is right smack dab in the middle, if you will, of what will become this Palestinian state. God clearly, as we read here, gave that land to Abraham and his descendants as an everlasting possession. So I think right there we see a major problem with this proposal, or any proposal that calls for a two-state solution. So just a couple of highlights that I thought about earlier. Number one, the plan calls for a Palestinian state. That's a two-state solution. This is not something that's new. That's what's been proposed every single time the parties have gotten together. Now, I would say this, that my view, the chances of this ever coming to pass are nothing more than a pipe dream. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I don't believe the Palestinians are ever going to allow it to happen. And if they did, it's only a matter of time before Hamas or some other terrorist group group moves in and takes over what would be the West Bank portion of this new state, which they already have over in Gaza, which is over on the Mediterranean Sea, which is where all of the rockets are launched from that have been coming into, and recently the balloons with explosives attached to them and so forth. So that would soon become very quickly a terrorist state. Now, if you look up at the very top of the new proposed territory at Qualapa, I think it's pronounced, that the distance from the edge of that portion, or really any portion of this new West Bank state, is very narrow, which is going to make it increasingly difficult, if this were to come to pass, for Israel to defend themselves. I'm kind of surprised that they're willing to go along with it. Back of my mind, I say to myself, I have to believe Netanyahu knows this is never going to come to pass, but he's in a tough position. He's running for office. Gantz is running for office. He can't be looked upon with everything that I believe the Trump administration has done. And this is just me talking, has done for Israel. I don't believe that he can bring a negative attitude to the party. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. But one of the things that has been discussed forever is the decrease in the territory from the Mediterranean to the edge of this new state, that it is probably 9 or 10 miles wide at that point, which is going to become almost indefensible. So we've got that going on. So it's going to take allegedly 4 years. We mentioned the conditions that the Palestinians have to give up terrorism. They have to give up this pay for slay program, which is where, they will literally pay the family of terrorists or people that have been martyred by strapping bombs onto themselves. They'll pay them a monthly or a quarterly or yearly stipend for what they've done. That's got to stop. The other thing is that the hatred that these people have for Israel is inculcated in them at a very early age. They start right out when kids are old enough to read or to understand, telling them that all the Jews deserve to be killed and destroyed. And if you looked at the Palestinian Charter or the Hamas Charter, you don't see any reference to Israel whatsoever. The idea that this mindset can change, I'm not saying it can't happen, but I think the chances are pretty remote that can ever happen. So overcoming the hatred that is there. The other thing that's part of this plan is, as I said, the Jerusalem, including Eastern Jerusalem, is going to be declared, or has been declared to be the eternal capital of Israel. The problem with that is that back in '67, after the Six-Day War, when Israel took back Jerusalem for the first time in several thousand years, that they gave administrative control of Temple Mount to the Arabs. It's called the Arab or Muslim Waqf, WAQF. It has administrative control. From what I can see in going through this, that will continue. And that brings to mind what we read a couple of weeks ago in Zechariah chapter 12, where it says that Jerusalem will become a cup of trembling to the entire world. That I don't believe, first of all, I don't believe that anybody that's related to this whole situation on the Arab side is ever going to approve that the Temple Mount being declared, shall we say, the eternal capital of Israel. Because remember, Temple Mount is where the original first and second Jewish temples were erected. It's sacred ground for them. They're planning to rebuild their temple. We see in Daniel and Matthew and Second Thessalonians and Revelation that there will be a temple. At the same time, it's considered to be the third holiest site for Islam, even though Jerusalem's not mentioned once in the Quran. It's their third holiest site, which is the site of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So what's going to happen there? We know, as we will get into Daniel and other chapters, that there will be a temple there. And so we'll see what happens. Megan.
Are you saying that Jerusalem is not? Are you saying that it's not biblical for Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel?
No, it is biblical. Yeah, we read in so many places that God's eyes are upon Jerusalem 24 hours a day, 300. That's his city. He gave it to the Jewish people, so it is theirs. They lost control of it. They lost control of it. The question was, are we saying that Jerusalem has always been the capital of Israel, right? Essentially.
No, I thought you were saying that it was. You were saying something about Jerusalem eternally being the capital of Israel, and somehow I was interpreting that as not being good for Israel.
No, it is good. It's their sacred city. It's Jerusalem is part of Israel, obviously. It goes back to the time of David. David captured Jerusalem 1,000 years BC or so. Jerusalem is where God ordered Solomon to build the first temple, which is where the glory of God actually resided. So it's a sacred spot. It's where God will commune, if you would, with the Jewish people.
And this plan keeps Jerusalem as the capital.
Right. Right. So the plan calls for at least this part, which is a good thing, but we have to face the fact that the Temple Mount is still under the control of the Muslim community, and it's still going to be hotly contested. Questions on that? Ideas? Thoughts? Okay. I don't know what it means when they say that Israel is going to retain sovereignty over East Jerusalem, with the exception of East Jerusalem, that will ultimately be determined to be the capital of this new Palestinian state. That is obviously a part that they've carved out in order for that to occur. So that's kind of a really high-level overview. We've looked at Genesis 13. Let me pass out another map that I think is interesting right here. Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. All right, this is another map. It's kind of blurry, but this is the second map that I sent out. One of the things we know from what we read in Genesis and the book of Joshua and other places is that God has given to the Jewish people land that is much greater than what we know Israel to be today. And if you look at this particular one, if people can see it out there, this is the map. Within the red border is really the land that God has given to the Jewish people, to Israel. It's much bigger and greater than what they currently occupy. You can see what they currently occupy is just a small percent of the total. And so we know that when Jesus returns, that all of this land will be given back to them. And so let's just quickly go to the book of Joel. We've looked at this before as we're talking about that they've never fully occupied all the land that God gave to them, but he considers his land, and it is his land, the land that God has given to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he considers it to be sacred. And one of the things we learn as we go through the scriptures, particularly as we talk about the coming judgments and the tribulation and so on and so forth, that the one that's orchestrating all of these events is God. Well, we can say that this has happened and that's happened, but God, I believe, has taken the chess pieces and moving them all into place, just like we've talked about with the with the all the technology and the facial recognition and the all of the other biometrics things that are happening, that all of these things are being put in place. So when Antichrist comes on the scene, all he has to do essentially is turn a switch. But we see that he's given them all of this land that is within these borders. They've never occupied, they've come close, but never occupied all of it. But the fact is, God said, I give it all to them, and at some point in time, he is going to make sure that they have all of it. So we see Israel, and of course, we looked at this one map where we see Hebron, and the point that I made there was Hebron is where God told Abram, look as far north, as far south, east, and west as you can. I give you all of this land. And then if we look at Joel chapter 3, and we've looked at this many times throughout the course of this study, in Joel chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. In those days and at that time, as we said, in those days and at that time just simply means at some point in the future. Well, and we know it's well into the future. Joel probably written, I'm going to say 400 or 500 BC. And so what he is prophesying here has not yet fully come to pass. And so it's something that will come to pass, and it lays out, at least in part, this what we're going to read here, the reasons why God is going to bring the judgment he's going to bring. He goes, in those days and at that time, so at some point in the future, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, it says, I will gather all nations. Notice he's doing it. I will gather. This is a reference to the Battle of Armageddon or War of Armageddon, however you want to phrase it, at the end of the tribulation. That all of the nations, because, you know, we go back to Zechariah where it says, Jerusalem will be a cup of trembling, a stumbling block, a burdensome stone to the whole world, and it's just not going to go away. By burdensome stone that we read about in some translations in the in Zechariah 12, it means it's so heavy they can't get rid of it. They can't get it out of the way. It's an ongoing obstacle. Tiny little Jerusalem. I think as we said before, the peace of Jerusalem does not depend on the peace of the world. The peace of the world depends upon the peace of Jerusalem. And so as we get closer to the return of Christ, everything is ultimately going to center on tiny little Jerusalem. Not New York City or Washington, D.C. or London or Paris, tiny little Jerusalem. And that's what we're seeing now. All of these things like this plan, which I'm not arguing the intentions of what is being done here or attempted here. It's great because the hatred is so intractable that people will do anything to try to make it work. It says, I will gather all nations, not some nations, but all nations. And so that has to include the United States, or what's left of the United States. You got to remember, this is at the end of that 7-year period of tribulation. I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will enter into judgment against them. So here's what we have is a picture of this giant army, not the Ezekiel 38, 39 army, but this giant, the huge numbers of, and I think I've heard as many as 180,000 or million or whatever troops that will come together at the Valley of Megiddo and come together against Israel for the purpose of finally wiping Israel, Jerusalem off the face of the map. It's at this point that Jesus Christ will come back, just as the armies of the world are ready to bring judgment upon or to attack Jerusalem, which during the second half of that tribulation period, that last 3.5 years, is going to go through a tremendous distress. There I will enter into judgment against them concerning, notice this, my inheritance, my people Israel. Now, God chose Israel. He chose them for a number of purposes and a number of reasons. And back in the book of Ezekiel, we know one of those reasons is that it's through Israel that he reveals himself to the world. And we know that with the Ezekiel 38 thing, for example, where all these nations will ultimately move on Israel, and God's going to destroy 6/7 of them. And he's going to do it supernaturally. And he is going to prove to the world that he is just exactly his, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, concerning my people Israel. Now here's the reason. He lays it out. For they scattered my people among the nations. So what happened to the Jews from roughly 500 BC up until, well, 1948 or just slightly before that, is they were scattered to the four nations, to the world. They're scattered throughout the world, exactly as God warned them way back in Deuteronomy and other places. He did scatter them, but here God says, they scattered my people among the nations. And think about the fact that the Jewish people have never lost their identity, they've never lost their heritage. They're still Jews, even though they were scattered and dispersed for thousands or 2,000 plus years. So they scattered my people. But then what it doesn't say in this, it does in many other places, is that he will begin to bring them back from the four corners of the earth, which is what we have been seeing in earnest from Israel's founding in 1948. And here's the key to what we're looking at today. Divided up my land. So when I look at this map and I see this plan to give a new state of Palestine, or create a new state of Palestine, and Israel is already just a small portion, has a small portion, a very small, minute portion of all the land that God gave them. You can go back to when Israel became a nation in 48. Originally, they were supposed to get all of what was called Transjordan, which is much larger, but the Arabs protested against that, and finally, the United Nations declared that okay, we're going to give them this piece of land that they actually was smaller than that because they've taken back the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They did that during the Six-Day War in 1967. So prior to 67, it was even smaller than what it is today. So take this tiny little piece of real estate and further divide it. And you say to yourself, this is what God says is going to cause the Battle of Armageddon. This is what it's all about. They divided not their land, my land. And so we see that. They cast lots for my people and traded boys for prostitutes. They sold girls for wine that they might drink. So we see clearly here that God has a plan for Israel. He's going to bring them back. We read in Amos chapter 9 that when he brings them back the second time, and the first time was after the Babylonian captivity, which we'll talk about when we get into Daniel a little bit. He brought them, but when he brings them back the second time, which we've seen, which has been going on since 1948 in earnest, going from roughly 600,000 to nearly 7 million today, that they never again will be scattered. Amos 9:15 basically says, never again will they be scattered or will they be cast out. Doesn't mean they're not going to suffer and be persecuted and experience all kinds of difficulties, but they're never again, they're there to stay. And so the world, however, doesn't know the first thing about what we read here in God's Word. You know, it's just amazing to me that anybody that knows anything about God's Word. And I'm not being cruel because again, I think that President Trump is doing as much as he possibly can. But I have to tell you that something like this kind of bothers me because we have to go back to Genesis chapter 12. And we've talked about that many times in this class. That Genesis 12 is where God made certain promises to Abraham and his descendants, including that he would give them the land forever, and that he would bless those who bless and curse those that curse them. And when he said that to Abraham, he meant his not just Abraham, but Isaac, Jacob, and all of their descendants, including the Jews today. And we have example after example throughout history of empires and nations that have been cursed because of their treatment of Israel. I believe that the United States, probably the greatest experiment in the history of the world, we're on a slippery slope because we're turning away from Jesus Christ, we're turning away from the Bible, we're turning away from God. I do applaud President Trump for speaking to the evangelical group he spoke to a couple of weeks ago and putting forth legislation to allow kids to again pray in school. That's fantastic. And also, we've been a supporter of Israel. But if you look at what's going on here, I will just have to wait and see how this shakes out. Because it's being proposed right now. I don't think that the Palestinians are ever going to go for it. And there's a part of me that says that Bibi and Gantz and all of the others in Israel know that it's not going to work. But time will tell on that. Time will tell. Now, what's interesting here is that, and I think we talked about that a few minutes ago, is if you look at the map, or the proposed map, you see that dotted line, and that's the tunnel that was talked about earlier that's supposed to connect Gaza, part of the new Palestinian state, with the West Bank, the other part. So going right underneath, I don't know, I'm sure it'll be a super reinforced concrete tunnel or something. I can't imagine it, but it's going to connect the two and it's going to go right under Israel. And so that's been one of the big things for the longest time. How do you connect? Well, here it is right here. That's the proposal. Pardon me? Yeah.
In England.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So.
Also, I have a question. Isn't there a dollar amount? Wasn't it 15?
Yeah, President Trump is,
$1 billion?
yeah, 50 billion.
Yeah.
50 billion
For
for the Palestinians.
for the Palestinians?
Right, right.
Well, how much weight would that carry in them making this thing work?
You know, the Palestinians have been given money for many times, and go back to the Arafat days and how they skimmed it all off and took it for themselves. So you worry about corruption and those types of things, and I don't think, knowing this president, that he would not give the money unless he knew the conditions were being met, which to me says that they may never get the money, if you know what I'm saying. But if they do, I would be surprised. There'd have to be a major shift in the way they think over there in order for that money to find its way to the people. You know, the economy in Gaza, for example, is horrible. Unemployment's 50-60%, whereas Arabs that live in Jerusalem, live in Israel, have good paying jobs. The unemployment rate is very low. So,
But wouldn't they do this to get the money anyway, whether it goes to the people or not?
yeah, well, I think but this is one of the differences from what I can see in this plan is they have to prove it. They have to agree and to,
This is a 10-year
right,
graduated thing.
Right.
So they've got to make like progress payments, you might say.
Okay.
Progress to get paid.
Yeah.
And then they can move on.
So let's take a look at Leviticus 25. All the way back in the book of Leviticus, so way back. And when you read things like this, you know they're as relevant today as when they were written 4,000 or so years ago. But Leviticus 25, verse 23, which is also something that I think that most leaders are totally unaware of. But it reads very simply, the land, referring to Israel, must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. And when it says sold permanently, that means traded, given away, must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you, Israelites, are but aliens and my tenants. So while he has given them authority to occupy and to control the land, it's God's land. And so what does that say? That says that that when the world is trying to come up with these schemes and ideas and peace proposals, whatever you want to call them, it's tantamount to sticking their finger in God's eye. Remember, he said way back in Zechariah that Israel, the Jewish people, are the apple of his eye. And so to do that when the world does that, throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. So God's made it very clear from way back as early as Leviticus. Now let's take another look go back to Genesis 15. And you know, there are many, many, many scriptures that talk about the land and the eternal nature of the land. But let's go to Genesis 15. Beginning in Genesis 15, verse 18. This is where God affects or brings about the unconditional covenant with Israel, or with Abraham and with his descendants. Most times a covenant or a treaty or a contract is between two parties. One party agrees to do one thing in exchange for something else. The bank will loan us money in exchange for our promise to repay it back with interest or whatever. This particular covenant or contract was solely fulfilled by God, which is where Abraham was told to divide the sacrifices, the pieces, to separate them. And then God put Abraham into a very deep sleep, and God himself walked between the offerings, the sacrifices, by himself. And at the time, a covenant or a contract was brought about by the two parties going through that and doing it in a figure eight fashion, figure eight way. And that's how a covenant was struck in those days. But in this particular case, God did it by himself, which means that the covenant, which includes the land, includes the building of the nation, includes the promise that ultimately the Jews will honor God Almighty, honor Jesus Christ, and all the other components to it, that he did it by himself. So it's an eternal, unconditional, nothing Israel has to do now or in the past or in the future is going to negate that promise, that covenant. If God makes a covenant, it's eternal and nothing's going to get in the way with it. So in verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot, that symbolizes God, with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, God made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give this land from the river of Egypt, which is this particular map, the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites and the Kadmonites and so forth, and the Jebusites. So he says that I am giving this land to your descendants. And up above, the purpose of him walking between the firepot, or his spirit going between the firepot, however it occurred, symbolizes an everlasting unconditional covenant. So what he's saying here is that 4,000 years from now, when the Jews are back in the land and everybody's trying to come up with some idea to further divide my land, understand that it belongs to them and it was given to them as an eternal inheritance. So we'll see what happens with this covenant or with this plan. Personally, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but you never know. And if it does, I don't believe that it'll be anything permanent or lasting. I just don't think it's in the nature of the Palestinian people. And that doesn't mean that they're all terrorists. Certainly not all Palestinians are terrorists, but there are certainly enough of them that in the sentiment in general is pretty much anti-Israel. So we'll see what happens. This is something that people have been waiting to come out for a long period of time, and time will tell. The question I had received today was somebody asked me that, do I think that this is part of God's plan of Bible prophecy? I mean, we don't know all the details, but it certainly seems to fit with everything else that's going on. Again, God's going to do it. He's going to put all those pieces in place, and then he's in charge, and he's going to take care of that. Questions, comments before we move on?
Does this plan include that the Palestinians will recognize Israel's right
Yes,
to
I
exist?
should have brought that up. It did. It does. That's another requirement, that the Palestinian or the Arabs recognize Israel's right to exist. I believe Arafat at least spoke that when the Oslo Accords were signed back in '93. But then he made it very clear that he just spoke those words. He didn't mean it. And so that is a requirement. The current leader of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, he's 80-some years old. I don't know how much longer he's going to be around, but he's made it very clear that that's not something that he would entertain. And clearly, Hamas, and Hamas, by the way, is just they're a proxy for Iran, just like Hezbollah. So behind a lot of the stuff that's going on over there, like everything else, is Iran. So we'll see what goes on. Anything more? Okay, we got like 5 minutes left. We started this last week, and I want to just introduce us to a couple of ideas that come from the book of Daniel. Again, we started this last week. We didn't get very far, and we didn't get very far tonight, but you just never know what's going to happen. I can't guarantee next week we'll get much further, but we'll see. So Daniel, what I want to do is we're not going to do an in-depth study of Daniel chapter to chapter to chapter, but there are certain chapters that I want to spend some time talking about in the next few weeks because they are pertinent, they're relevant. And as we're going to see as we go through Daniel, it is one of the most documented books in the Bible. It is one of the most, if not the most prophetic books in the Bible, literally hundreds of prophecies in the book of Daniel that either have been fulfilled, are in the process of being fulfilled, or will be fulfilled. And so I just thought that to really tie everything together, it'd be good to spend some time. So I want to read a quote from Dr. Criswell, who was a pretty well-known theologian from days gone by, about the veracity and the importance of the book of Daniel. And he wrote, Josephus, who was a Roman, or he was a scholar, an historian, not a Bible-believing one, but he wrote a lot of commentaries and historical things relating to Old and New Testament times. But Josephus, this is Dr. Criswell saying, Josephus, throughout his histories, makes much of the book of Daniel. The Jewish historian was a contemporary of Paul and John. In about AD 80, Josephus wrote the story of his people from Abraham down to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. One of the most moving and beautiful narratives in all of literature is his story of the sparing of the holy city by Alexander the Great during the latter's conquest of the Persian Empire. As we see when we get into the second chapter and the seventh chapters of Daniel, that God provides visions, if you will, of empires to come. And we read in Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar, the leader of the Babylonian Empire, had a vision of a statue. And that statue had different components, including the head of gold and the breastplate and the legs and so on and so forth. And each one of those, as we read, when we go through Daniel, represented coming empires. And so Daniel, or Nebuchadnezzar, has this dream of this statue. Daniel, as we'll see next week, comes along and interprets what the statue represents and identifies empires that would ultimately replaced Babylon. We know that Babylon was defeated by the Mede-Persian Empire. Then the Mede-Persian Empire was defeated by Greece, and then Greece was defeated by Rome. And this image, this statue, later confirmed in Daniel 7, depict all of those empires, and including Babylon and the ones that were to come afterwards. And so, exactly as Daniel foresaw and provided to us through the book came to pass. But he goes on to say one of the most moving and beautiful narratives in all of literature is his story of the sparing of the holy city by Alexander the Great during the latter's conquest of the Persian Empire. So we all know Alexander the Great was the leader of Greece, the Greek Empire. He just went through that part of the country like gangbusters and was quick to overcome and defeat the Persian Empire. He died at a very young age, 33, but when he died, rather than leaving the territory, the empire, to his children or to his relatives, he left it to his 4 generals. And that is exactly what was prophesied in Daniel chapter 8 and other places. It is recounted in his Antiquities, this is Josephus of the Jews, in chapter 11, or in books 11, chapter 8. The conquering Alexander, during his siege of Tyre, Tyre being Lebanon today, had made appeal to the Jews for provision for his army. Jaddua, the high priest, refused, saying that he had sworn to be faithful to Darius, the Persian king. So Darius, Persia was still in control when Alexander asked for provisions from this Jewish priest. This made Alexander furious. After he destroyed Tyre and after his destruction of Gaza, Alexander turned his wrath to his invincible army against Jerusalem. Jaddua the high priest was terrified, but God told him in a dream how to save the city. Carrying out the instructions of the Lord, Jaddua dressed his priests in white. He himself put on his glorious garments with a scarlet robe, breastplate, and gold mitre. So he was obviously the high priest to wear those robes and so forth. Followed by a procession of priests and people in white, he went out to meet Alexander, singing the songs of Zion. The Macedonian, or Alexander, was overwhelmed, and especially so when Jaddua showed him Daniel 8:1-8, and Daniel 8:15-22, passages that foretold his coming and his victories. So here's Alexander the Great ready to go in and just wipe Jerusalem out again. And he reads the account, or his story, clearly laid out in the book of Daniel before, written out before he actually embarked on this thing. So we have that. And then we'll also see when we get to Daniel, later in Daniel 9, that one of the leaders of the Persian Empire, Cyrus, his name is specifically mentioned in the book of Isaiah, 150 years before he was born. His name is written twice and referred to as the servant of God, and then Cyrus will come along and fulfill some very real purposes for God later on. The narrative continues saying that Alexander worshiped God and offered sacrifices in the temple. So this gets to the inerrancy and the veracity of the book of Daniel. One other thing that I want to read. Sir Isaac Newton, I don't know if people knew that, but he was a strong evangelical Christian who studied Bible prophecy. He was one that was constantly studying prophecy. Sir Isaac Newton, the great scientist who discovered the law of gravity, wrote in his book, Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel in the Apocalypse of St. John, which is Revelation, these words, quote, "Whoever rejects the prophecy of Daniel does as much as if he undermined the Christian religion, which, so to speak, is founded on Daniel's prophecies of Christ." And we'll see those. We get to Daniel 9 is an amazing prophecy. A copy of this book, printed in 1773, became one of the prized volumes in Thomas Jefferson's library. It now resides in the Library of Congress. So Daniel is so amazing and full of so many prophecies that I think it's important that we go through and take a look. At least I want to look at chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 9, which contains one of the most amazing prophecies in all the Bible. We'll go to that through that in pretty good detail. But we're running short of time. Again, for the second week in a row, we've introduced the book of Daniel. So next week, hopefully we can get into it a little bit. Covered a lot of material. Questions or comments, any thoughts or ideas anybody might have? Any questions coming in, Don? No? Okay. All right. So with that, we'll close, get together again next week and